My name is Rashad Robinson, and I'm the Executive Director of Color of Change. I'm going to talk a little bit about our work, about our theory of change, how we do the work, sort of where we're heading in terms of our work around economic justice and accountability, specifically as it relates to the media, and then hopefully have an opportunity for questions and discussion and really talk about sort of some of the things that we're learning and continue to learn about how to elevate the voices of everyday people utilizing technology to hold those in power accountable. And essentially that's the mission of Color of Change. We started about 7 years ago in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. There were a number of activists, in particular Van Jones and James Rucker, who were outraged over sort of what was happening in the Gulf Coast, and particularly the failure of our government to adequately do what was right, and the failure of our sort of civil rights movement to be able to quickly mobilize the voices of all of those people who were seeing these images on TV to do more than sort of give money to the Red Cross or you know, this is before really sort of Facebook and before there was ever a thing called Twitter, to sort of do more than just sort of be outraged within their individual circles. And so Color of Change started with this idea that every single day we're hit with all sorts of news, right? We wake up in the morning and we maybe see the radio, or we listen to the radio, we see the newspaper, we see something on television, we see billboards on our way to work. And all of that makes us activated in some way. You know, there's a presentation that we have on Flash that wouldn't work on the computer, but we have sort of an image that turns red, sort of as you're seeing those images. But oftentimes, what happens right after we sort of turn red with either joy or anger or outrage is we go back to doing what we were doing before. Now in the age of Facebook, we can sometimes post something on our Facebook page and get some responses from people. But generally after that, we go back to doing what we were doing. What we try to do at Color of Change is turn those moments into movements and take what sort of that moment where people are outraged and connect them with people who are having that same experience all around the country and sometimes all around the world, and build the type of numbers and energy that can lead to change. We operate from an organizing perspective on something we call the ladder of engagement. So oftentimes we're giving people a really small ask, something like signing a petition. And then we're moving them to deeper and deeper asks along the way, from making phone calls to showing up to rallies to meeting with their representatives, all with a clear theory of change that if we can mobilize these set of people with a clear message and a clear goal, we can sort of have sort of impact on a particular person, a particular entity, and in the end lead to system change. One of the most well-known campaigns that Color of Change ran in the media that really sort of helped us grow was, a couple of years ago, about 3 years ago, Glenn Beck went on Fox News when he still had his show on Fox News, on Fox and Friends, the morning show. How many people have seen Fox and Friends? Yeah, I'm sorry. But sometimes we do have to watch that stuff. So, he went on Fox and Friends and he called President Obama a racist with a deep-seated hatred for white people and the white race. And he went on and he said it very matter-of-factly, so matter-of-factly that he kind of outraged the host of Fox and Friends, who kind of questioned him and said, their faces were shocked, which if anyone's watched Fox and Friends, these are not folks who share our views or politics in any way, shape, or form. Color of Change had been monitoring Fox and Friends and Fox News in general. We had a campaign called Turn Off Fox and had been getting bumper stickers out in the world on people's cars, had been mobilizing people. But this was a moment, right, where like everyone who instantly saw it was sort of outraged. It hit some blogs, but people were going to go back to doing what they were going to do. At that moment, we took that moment and turned that into sort of an organizing moment, starting out with a petition, to not Fox News, but to the corporate sponsors of the Glenn Beck show. that led to a campaign that sort of mobilized the classic ladder of engagement that we used, that mobilized about 285,000 of our members over the course of 2 years to get over 200 national advertisers to leave the Glenn Beck Show. Every time an advertiser would leave, the Fox would go find a new advertiser to replace them until there were no more advertisers left that could sponsor the Glenn Beck Show. So by the last episode of the Glenn Beck show, there was that company that you put gold in an envelope and send it in and melt it down and they send you back cash. That was the kind of commercial that was playing over and over and over again. The ratings hadn't necessarily changed on the Beck Show, but what had happened was that Fox News could no longer make money off of it. And in the process, black folks and their allies were able to see their power of being able to hold a corporate entity accountable for how their stories were told and how they were portrayed in that light. And in the process, have a win against an entity that they probably thought they never would. And that success was sort of part of the Color of Change story. Now, there is a story that's being told in mainstream media every single day. And so part of the work of Color of Change is not just to work sort of challenging the news, but challenging what's happening in popular culture and challenging what's coming out of Hollywood as well. And there's a story that's coming out of Hollywood that's telling a story of black folks and people of color. And it's a story, whether it's on our reality television shows or whether it's in our dramas or our sitcoms, and it's a story that those who have done something great to have it, and those who do not have somehow done something to put themselves in that situation, and that there's sort of no other factors at play, that getting rich is just around the corner. And that whether it's our reality television shows that try to tell a story of our reality, or it's the dramas, we're told that being rich is something that people have earned and they deserve it and they are to be upheld, and for folks who are not, that they belong there. And regardless of what type of stories get told on MSNBC, whatever type of stories may happen on PBS, many more people are going home every night and turning on entertainment television than they are on the news programs that we may watch when we don't raise our hands to watching Fox and Friends. And out of the top 100 television shows on TV, 20 of them are crime procedures. So those stories that every single day tell the story of the hero law enforcement figure and the criminal black or Latino man, or female, the story of the welfare mother who doesn't care about her children and is abusing them and the police officers have to come in, or the story of the police officer who somehow steps outside of what protocol is but gets the bad guy in the end, and so we want to root for him. And as a result, it tells a story that makes us believe that stop and frisk in New York is okay, regardless of sort of the other stories we're told, because 20 million people are watching those as opposed to the less than 1 million people they may watch a story about stop and frisk on one of the TV shows on MSNBC during their primetime hour. And so, we've got to do more as a movement at just not sort of dealing with what's on the op-ed pages in the New York Times or the LA Times or the Washington Post, or getting our great story on MSNBC, which is all important, but dealing with sort of the way that our stories are being told in pop culture and use popular culture as an advantage. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our Alec campaign, because besides the fact that it was widely covered on all the news programs that I just told you wasn't important, it was a story about utilizing popular culture and developing a campaign that kind of took on an issue in a way that stepped outside of sort of, I think, the classic way that we want to think about sort of organizing or facing down power. And so while we talk about Alec on the run, our campaign was never against Alec. No one knows who Alec is. It's the American Legislative Exchange Council. Most people on my staff did not know who Alec was. We had to do a whole lot of research to learn. There are a lot of folks that had been researching and working on Alec for 10, 15 years. In fact, Alec is a 40-year-old organization. It's part of sort of the radical right-wing infrastructure. They were founded by the same person who founded the Heritage Foundation. They are, part of the infrastructure that pushes out information. What ALEC essentially does is they write something called model legislation. And they write model bills every year, and then their state legislators, who are members along with corporate members, push these laws out into states around the country. So everything dealing with our economic life, to how criminal justice and prison issues are dealt with, to voter ID laws, to gun laws, are all part of ALEC's agenda. And corporations sit behind closed doors with legislators, and they write the bills. So it is such a streamlined process, so much that we've seen in some states, state legislators introducing ALEC bills and forgetting to remove the ALEC header off the paper when they introduce the bill into the state legislature, and have to pull it back because with a red face. ALEC has been doing this work for 40 years, and over the last 10 and 15 years has been incredibly effective at moving their agenda, and not only driving change in the states, but change that moved up to federal law, as well as making sure their alumni like John Boehner, Eric Cantor, and others moved to national prominence as well. By 2011, ALEC had grown tremendously, and we had started to look at what they were doing around voter ID laws. We were outraged. We didn't know sort of how to take on voter ID laws, because in all the states that they had passed, there was no theory of change for us. And so at Color of Change, we need a theory of change to both move a message in the media and move it through our members. And there was no political change that could happen. The state legislatures where the law had passed, the political makeup wasn't going to change anytime soon. And so we couldn't try to mobilize our members to fight back against it, because the Tea Party legislatures weren't going to hear from our members. But what we did find out was that ALEC, 98% of its funding was coming from corporations. So every day, these corporations that come to black folks in our community and say, buy our products and use our services, were funding ALEC at 98%. And that was where our strategic insight happened, right? ALEC funnels this money. These corporations funnel this money into ALEC. The money goes to politicians, and then, how that got up there? And then the money from the politicians goes directly to the state government, and then what you get is laws that disenfranchise nearly 5 million Americans. The increase of prisons, the shrinking of wages and benefits, and economic security. All of these things were sort of impact of the laws that these corporations, right, wanted to get passed, but didn't want their name on. And so ALEC was sort of the secret vehicle by which, the Coca-Colas, the Pepsis, the Walmarts of the world could move their laws through state governments and sort of kind of keep their hands off of it. We sort of knew instantly that our goal here was not to go after ALEC. We'd be spending a whole lot of time and energy trying to explain to people what ALEC was. Our goal was, everyone knows who Coca-Cola is and Walmart and Pepsi, and they spend a lot of money letting people know. And so we took the 120 corporations that sponsor ALEC, and we said, this sort of comes from, once again, growing up short and having a short father who tells you when you find a bully, you're being bullied, you go onto the playground and you take out the biggest one first. And whether you win or not, people might think that you're either crazy or they don't want to mess with you. And so we decided we were going to pick at 15 corporations. And we were going to pick at the 15 corporations that sort of had deep relationships in the black community, sponsored civil rights museums, spent a lot of money on their social marketing, their social responsibility. And we said, if we can pick on 15 corporations and say, We may not be able to run a full-scale boycott on you that's going to hurt you economically, but we're going to certainly hurt your investment, your social responsibility investment. We're going to make that, we're going to damage that and damage these millions of dollars you put in because you've been secretly putting money into this company and into this organization that's been behind these laws. And so we started out with simple letters behind the scenes to these corporations. We sent them letters, and then we started with back and forth conversations with heads of social responsibility. We at first got letters with them explaining how they support both sides. You know, we give money to the Center for American Progress and the NAACP, and we also give money to Alec. And we would always say that there's really not two sides to black people voting in this upcoming election. And so you should keep giving money to CAP and keep giving money to the NAACP, but we're not really negotiating with you about sort of putting money in both pots. That's perfect. So, you know, the mix of sort of deep research really helped to drive it. A lot of research was done by folks like CAP and like the Center for Media and Democracy and their Alec Exposed, and it really helped us as we went back and forth with corporations, as they told us, we're not going to leave, and we're not necessarily behind these laws, or what's the impact of these laws. And so we started finding, more and more corporations, and we started really explaining to them the sort of impact on the 5 million folks. And then we on November 17th, we sort of launched our campaign publicly, and we didn't name any corporations. And so while we were having these discussions, we started getting more and more signatures on this petition. And other organizations joined us, and we started to dig in. And by January 25th, we had a large number of folks who had really signed our petition, and that was right around the time that we learned of the Trayvon Martin tragedy in March, and our members were separately mobilizing around that. It wasn't until sort of around that time that the connection between Stand Your Ground laws and Alec was made, and for us, it instantly was sort of a pivot opportunity. We were mobilizing. We had 200,000 people that were, mobilizing for justice for Trayvon, but wanted to know what they could do more, right? It wasn't sort of enough for our members just to go after George Zimmerman or to hold folks in Sanford, Florida accountable, but what more could they do? And in terms of sort of how do we sort of drive a media frame and ensure that the media isn't just making sort of incidents of racial inequality about individuals, but really talking about systems, we also thought that this was, once again, another moment to have a systems conversation, a systems about how do laws get created, how are laws put in place, and then how and who they then impact. In April 4th, we started to escalate publicly. We had, behind the scenes, had Pepsi pull out, and then we decided when you have Pepsi that after a number of conversations decide they no longer want to become part of Alec, the next corporation you go after is Coke. And so we started escalate. We went after Coke, and we sent them sort of what a public campaign could look like. We sent them the website, the fact that phone calls would start coming, and we gave them 48 hours to pull out. And Coke did not pull out. And so we hit send. And our members started calling Coke, and within 5 hours of our members calling Coke, Coke called us and said, we're pulling out of Alec. And we're pulling out of Alec, and can you please stop having your members call us? And we said, okay, thank you. And at that point, the ball started rolling. That's when the media obviously started covering. They had a clear story now. Now it wasn't a nonprofit versus a nonprofit, but it was Coke, a major sort of public brand, pulling out of this sort of shady organization that wasn't going to send anyone into the media to talk, out of this company. they were pulling out of Alec. Kraft instantly said, which was sort of our next company we had been talking to, said that they were staying in Alec and that they weren't going to do anything. I was on MSNBC that night, and when they said that, I said, well, Kraft's going to be next. And that morning, Kraft decided to pull out before we even had a chance to hit send on our next email. Over the course of the next couple of weeks, the New York Times editorialized against Alec for the first time and what Alec had done, linking back to our petition on our petition page, on their editorial page. And corporation after corporation started to publicly pull out. We would send emails. Emails letting corporations know that they were next. And before we could sort of get things together to actually hit send, we would find out that they had pulled out, and they were sort of announcing it before we could sort of get to them. And we had to sort of draw back and sort of say, okay, so who's going to be our next set of corporations to go after? We ended up with about 100,000 people on the petition. It was, it was sort of an incredible movement. But then, we sort of got to the point where we knew that Alec was going to obviously be pivoting. And so Alec started working with corporations to sort of say, as corporations were pulling out, to say that they had pulled out last year and that we had bad information and we didn't know what we were doing. And this is where those behind-the-scenes letters were really helpful, because the dates on those letters from chief diversity officers defending their relationships with Alec didn't quite correspond with the public messaging that these corporations were having in public. And so when McDonald's said they pulled out last year, but there was a letter from them 2 months ago saying that they were staying in Alec and we're sorry, you're upset about this, that didn't sort of make them sort of endear them to the media. So, with all of our campaigns, and I think that this is incredibly important, especially in the age of social media, right, where we've got to mobilize the voices of everyday people, where we've got to consistently give people ways to respond. People are not joiners the way they used to be in organizations, right? Especially folks that are part of a Gen X, Gen Y demographic. They're not going to be card-carrying members of the ACLU or the card-carrying members of the NAACP or Color of Change. They're going to join campaigns that appeal to them, and they're going to move in and out of organizations and issues that they care about. And so, part of this was having a clear strategic insight. And the strategic insight for us was that 98% of the funding to Alec was coming from corporations. So there was a clear theory of change there. If we went after these corporations, we could really break down Alec's power. Having media savvy. So we would obviously repeat the same thing over and over again in media training, but we would tell a story that wasn't about the intricacies of Alec, wasn't about the intricacies of how Alec worked, but just told a story about how these corporations were going to black folks by day for our money and trying to take away our vote by night. And we would say that over and over again in the media and tell that story, put it all on the corporations, not allow them to have any out. And the behind-the-scenes communications that we had with them for months prior to going public allowed us to have a very reasonable argument when folks would say, well, aren't you all just being angry? Why are you blaming these corporations? Like, we had tons of conversations. We tried everything we could to educate them, and then we had to go public. Having a real organized constituency, and this is incredibly important because, we, Color of Change, exist in a community of other online organizing groups like our friends at Move On and Credo and other groups. And what's different about Color of Change in some of those groups is that we represent a constituency that exists in the real world for these corporations. These corporations don't see liberals or progressives as a constituency. They can see Latinos, black folks, women, gays and lesbians. They see these groups as constituencies that are part of their go-to-market strategy. And so in terms of holding corporations responsible for how they operate in the public space and forcing them to have to do something, understanding, helping them to really understand the constituency that they're impacting and having that organized constituency, push their power and weight is incredibly important. And then leveraging deep research. we do a couple of things at Color of Change from a communications perspective when we tell stories in the media. And there's three kind of key components of a Color of Change outreach and message. We illustrate concrete harm, meaning that we're very clear about who this is impacting, and we sort of walk folks through storytelling. And so we oftentimes try to stay away, we always try to stay away from sort of kind of civil rights messaging that isn't specific, messaging that isn't really clear to the exact issue, and things that feel sort of like they're a reach or they're flowery or can't be backed up by a footnote. We build common ground, and so we work really hard to not sort of specifically go after a specific target, but we don't try to go after another community as a whole. We try to find ways to broaden the base, even if that's sometimes really hard because the folks who are impacted are so clear. But we try to build through common ground and through storytelling, through maybe elevating the voice of a mother or a father or something in the story to try to create a universality to the issue. And then we never repeat our opponent's messages. And so, we will call it the shoot first law over and over and over again before we call it the stand your ground law. And over and over and over again, we will do everything we can not to repeat our opponent's messages. In an outreach, you'll see a very short, kind of succinct message, and then a link for people to post and sign, and then a lot more information about the issue for people that we can turn into evangelists, people who are going to have those conversations with their friend, family, network. So this was as of May 2012, but we had about 100,000 people who had participated in this campaign, and about 500,000. Over time, a number of other organizations started joining the campaign, started sending out the same email we were sending out. Organizations like Credo, Presente, Move On, all joined the Alec Campaign. Over 500,000 people. We're up to over 750,000 people that have joined the Alec Campaign. Over 40 corporations have dropped Alec at this point. Alec has had to give up their, according to roll call, Alec has had to give up their DC offices due to some funding challenges that they've had. And in the process has given up working on any gun laws or voting rights laws and has disbanded that committee. They disbanded that committee at about 20 corporations, and our basic message was that Alec has essentially went out in the water, spilt a bunch of oil, and said that they're no longer going to spill any more oil, but is not telling us how they're going to clean it up. And so any corporation that was with Alec then is responsible for this oil, and they've got to make a decision. And so we kept going and had 20 more corporations after Alec said that they were going to stop doing that work. This has been sort of a number of organizations were involved from research to work. There's still a lot of advocacy happening around Alec, a lot of work with unions around shareholder. But the larger message here is, picking a strategic insight, going after sort of where the dollars are coming from, and retelling and reframing the story about sort of who is responsible when crises happen. And we could have just simply stayed on sort of a George Zimmerman story and made this about an individual. As we were doing the Color of Change petition, about 2 weeks into our Color of Change work, we realized very quickly that the majority of the people that were signing our Trayvon petition were not black folks. The vast majority were white folks, and they were outraged, and they were concerned, and we did a lot of work to build common ground, asking them to write letters to the editor, moving their messages in the media. But we felt like if we had just kept it there and allowed it to be just about George Zimmerman and not moved as many of those people we could to a systems conversation, then we would have actually missed a moment to have people sort of think about their own actions as consumers or in the public space. There was a domino effect to all of this. I think that part of staying consistent on the messaging and sticking really clearly on the corporations meant that over and over again, the media was repeating our exact message, exactly the way we wanted them to, from the New York Times editorial pages on down. And you know, just in a matter of 3 months, we were able to have media appearances across the platform and actually build, I think, a lot of power. So, for instance, during this last election cycle, when Clear Channel decided that they weren't going to pull down these billboards that were intended to really suppress the vote in Wisconsin and Ohio, the minute we launched our petition, the Hollywood Reporter runs a story saying organization that took on Alec and Glenn Beck is going after CEO of Clear Channel. You know, 5 hours later, Clear Channel announces that they are pulling down the billboards. So it's also using media to tell a story, and tell a story about black people being able to have power to push corporations to do the right thing even when they don't want to. You know, I use this as a broader example of how we can use social media and good campaigning to sort of move a story and move a narrative, but also to hold those who are in power for either putting laws in place that affect our lives or telling our story in the media accountable. I do want to sort of take some time now to both, you know, answer some questions and maybe talk more about sort of theory of change and any intricacies about the campaign. But also, you know, before we finish, I definitely want to have some time to talk about sort of the work around economic justice that we're going to be doing moving into the next year.
Thank you so much, Rashad. And I want to apologize to Rashad and to the audience for the technical difficulties we had. Rashad sent me a video, I guess a couple of weeks ago, but it never came through for some technical reasons. So thank you for bearing with us. I have a couple of questions real quick before we turn it to the audience. One is a specific one, and one is more general along the economic security topic that you were talking about. Color of Change represents Black America and your allies, and you mentioned partner organizations that worked with you against Alec, and I was wondering if there are specific organizations that represent other communities that you work with or have identified as strategic partners.
Absolutely. So about 2 years after Color of Change was founded, James Rucker, who founded Color of Change, co-founded an organization along with Fabiana Rodriguez and a number of other Latino activists called Presente.org, which is, we call our sister organization. One of their organizers sits in our New York office, and their executive director and I speak pretty regularly. And they, during the Trayvon campaign, they sent out our outreach basically saying, you know, these are our brothers and sisters, and we're supporting them, and sent it out sort of as is. And there have been a number of times, and specifically around late hate crimes against immigrants, that we've sent out their outreaches. And they were involved with both the Clear Channel work and the work against Alec. And so Presente in particular, because they use a similar model that we use, so it's very easy. We can, like, you know, talk for 5 minutes and decide if there's synergy, and sometimes there's not, actually, because sometimes we've got to do more education in both communities to go out on something, but oftentimes we can be on the same page.
Great. I'm going to save my next question for the end in case, and if it comes up, I won't ask it, but I'm going to turn it over to the audience now. I saw Sam first.
Hi, Rashad. I'm Sam Fullwood. I'm at the Center for American Progress. I've never met you, and I'm really happy to hear you talk, hear what you had to say. I also spent 30 years before I went to the Center for American Progress as a newspaper journalist. And I wanted to, while I agree with everything that you said, I wanted to pose another way of looking at what the Color of Change is doing and perhaps maybe another theoretical model for the success that you've had that I didn't hear you speak of, which is much of the work that I have done as a journalist has also been looking at the intersection of media and the way it has impacted on people of color, particularly African Americans. And if you were to compare the way in which social movements are reported and drive public opinion, you'll find that when people often don't know and want to find out information about something that they didn't know anything about at all, and it does sort of in a way anger people or drive a conversation, you get support. And I would sort of compare that to, say, the 50s with the civil rights movement, where prior to reporting, particularly from northern newspapers, because the southern newspapers had nothing to do with it, northern reporters would go down in to tell that story and bring it back to the north, and people were outraged. And you had sort of then the nascent movement of people sort of coalescing around atrocities that had been going on, people knew about, but nobody had a way of tapping into. And I think that's part of what you all have done, say with Trayvon and with Alec. A note of caution, again, from the history of this. I remember having a long conversation with John Lewis about his, at that time, contemporaneous concern about the way in which the media, many of the people who had written about him and the Freedom Riders and the early days struggle, no longer were allies because the media had sort of moved to a different place, and that the use of media as a way of telling and framing the story is fickle, and that just as easily as it can be supportive, it can move away in ways that one may not know. And I would point to, say, the name of the organization is escaping my mind, but the media completely turned on right after Obama was elected. Acorn. Yes. Exactly. In such a way that it completely caught them off guard. And I guess the question I have is that so much of what you all are doing is using a new form of media, social media, to sort of link people together as they become concerned and outraged. Then they are also driving the narrative in the mainstream. And have you seen any sort of change in the mainstream toward what you're doing with the success? Because success, you get built up and then you get knocked down.
So absolutely, that's a great comment and question, and it's obviously something that we pay very close attention to. It's why we turn down far more campaigns than we take on. We get emails on a regular basis that would break your heart that simply are not the right moment and don't have the right elements for us to take on, and we have a really sort of critical vetting process behind what we get behind, and so that is definitely part of it. I do think that media is changing tremendously. Journalists that I talk to are waking up and Googling their beats in ways that they weren't before. And so in some ways, what's happening in the social media space is driving a lot of the conversations in mainstream media. And something we'll get to 50, 60, 100,000 signatures before we get sort of the type of mainstream coverage that we hope for. Very rarely do we get coverage for launching a campaign. And there are many campaigns that we launch that never make it into the mainstream media and maybe stay within black media or stay in progressive media or sort of don't break in to the space at all. And so in some ways there is a kind of vetting that happens based on sort of our members and their energy behind something, and then sort of what rises and doesn't rise to the top. And then that sort of does then end up driving what becomes news and what doesn't become news for us. And so oftentimes when something does break into the space, it's been vetted in a way that is been, you know, it's a very interesting back and forth that we have with our membership. And we oftentimes get our members pushback on campaigns. Remember one of the first campaigns when I took over executive director that I was set on, and the staff was with me, but it shows sort of an Oakland, New York City bubble that our two offices can live in, is that there was a young man named Deshaun Marmon who was kicked off of a U.S. airline flight for sagging his pants. And the video that was out was pretty horrible. They put him in shackles. He was a college student. They, like, when he was saying that he wasn't doing anything wrong, they basically said, you know, you're not like everybody else. You need to get off this plane. And they shackled him and took him off the plane. And we thought it was really a larger story to tell about, you know, both this corporation doing this, and we spent a lot of time crafting a message where we did not defend sagging pants. We acknowledged the wide range of views, and our members took us to task. And we got a lot of very long, lengthy messages, especially from members who are 40 and over, who talked to us about how folks used to dress up when they traveled, about how they, it was a moment for the staff, and I had to like sit down and write a very lengthy note to the members who sent us really good, strong, thoughtful messages, and we had to have this back and forth with them, acknowledging, sort of explaining once again why we were doing it in kind of greater detail than we could in sort of an outreach where we're actually trying to engage people in advocacy, but also acknowledge their point and acknowledge that these are not black and white issues, and that we hear them, and it also very much changed how we then moved the campaign forward and what we did or didn't do, and also the criticism we got within the media for our work on that campaign. And so I would say that we're not above critique. We're going to continue to get pushed back in the public space. Michelle Malkin spent a lot of time trying to turn me and my dimples into angry black man through a wide range of articles that were sort of like not very effective. But I say that like we do get our fair share of attacks as well. Yeah.
I saw Tom and then Barbara.
Tom Shapiro, the Institute on Assets and Social Policy. First, thank you very much for your victories and for inspiring. And I want to see if you can get us to help us with our thinking a little bit. I think at the end of the day, we are, among other things, about reframing the way Americans think success happens and lack of success happens. And we are dealing in addressing what those inequities are about pretty deep systems and pretty complex systems. And the road to redress is probably going to be some very transformative sets of policies and transformative institutional changes. And so what I would love to hear your thinking about is, well, we know, I would suggest it's relatively easy in the scheme of things to identify a challenger like Pepsi or Coke. Everybody knows what that is. Everybody knows what the investment is. But it's a lot more difficult to think about and explain residential segregation and the color coding of home equity, about how people who work in restaurants don't receive the minimum wage, about the tax code. So your thoughts about the stories that might help us identify, humanize, and move.
Yeah, so that is something that we've been thinking a lot about. We think a lot about, explaining voter ID laws and trying to run a campaign around it when 80% of people agree with them, and 70% of black folks agree with voter ID laws when you just say, should people show their ID at the polls, was sort of a thing that we had to sort of figure out. And by finding sort of a bad actor in the space that can help sort of help to crystallize the issue, And so I do believe that the way that corporations have consolidated, gained power, and have marginalized everyday people over the last 20 to 30 years in this country is, in so many ways, one of our best stories. And finding really bad actors in that space that you can tell stories that connect to them. So talking about the Wells Fargos of the world, or when you're talking about sort of the issue around sort of minimum wage and living wage and taking on Walmart in that process. And by pushing Walmart in the space, you're having a larger conversation about the sector. That is an entry point. It doesn't completely solve what you're talking about, but these are entry points into basically trying to have the type of political education with folks that you need to have, because people have very short attention spans. I know just from our data that our emails are set up into four different sections. A subject line, which we test multiple times because we know that most people will only read the subject line, and that will determine whether or not they open the email. Then there's a box up at the top that has no more than 10 words in it, and 10 words is way too much. And we know that another set of people will just read that box and decide whether or not they're going to click on the petition. Then there's 2 to 3 paragraphs, short paragraphs that happen above the fold. And the majority of people that take action on one of our campaigns will read that. And then there's a whole lot of stuff under it, like a lot of information, a lot of education. But the question is like figuring out how do we get people on board at the varying levels that we can get them on board. And so some people will read those different levels of information. And through the course of any campaign, if we can get them to read the subject line and open the email, we're much more likely down the road to get them to read more and more and more and get them deeper engaged down the line. But if we start off with the full story, we're going to get very few people to sort of read more once they decide that the issue is too complicated, that it's not sort of worth them fully understanding, or because it's complicated, it's insurmountable, and there's not sort of a real victory at hand. And I think that in so many ways, that was a lot of the problem with the early Alec work, is that there's this bad nonprofit in DC that we want to take out because they're doing all these things, and if we send all these postcards, we're going to get people engaged, instead of saying, here's one corporation that is sponsoring Alec. They also sponsor the Civil Rights Museum in Atlanta. Alec is responsible for this, and they are putting this much money into it. Tell them to stop. And then over time, right, more and more of our members, as we see just through communication with them and emails, they know more and more and more about who Alec is, but if we had started out with a full story, we wouldn't have gotten to where we got. And so I'm not sure if I completely answered your question, but I guess what I think is that you have to layer the story. You have to find villains within the space that help to sort of crystallize the issue, even if it doesn't tell the whole story. If it kind of gets people to a point where they can start thinking about it in terms of how they live every day and experience sort of their own commerce, then they can start sort of thinking about how they can be deeper engaged in your work. Website presence, and so there are people in the space that don't agree with me on this, but I think that websites are going to be increasingly less and less important. And anytime someone wants to build a microsite on something, I generally am like the person that stops the ball from moving further if we're involved. Because if you build it, they won't come. That's just not how people experience their communication. People already go to where they want to go to. They go to their Facebook page, they go to their Twitter account, they maybe go to a couple of news sites. And so you have to figure out who is my audience and how do I reach them where they are. And so an example is we started this microsite that I was like against called We Are Trayvon, We Are Trayvon.colorofchange.org, where it was a Tumblr account that allowed people to post stories and pictures and all that. And we had like 200,000 people to go out to say, post your stories and all of that. And so we got a good number of people who were posting information on that. Poems, pictures of them in hoodies, all sorts of stuff. And we also, and it was a very diverse audience. What we did was we said, you know, this is not enough for people who are just coming to this site, because we're actually not reaching who we want to reach with this, right? Anyone who's going to type in that information is part of the choir, not part of the people we want to like reach. And so what we did was we did a small Facebook ad buy where we basically bought New York Times, MSNBC, NBC, CNN. We bought basically anyone who listed that they worked at all these major news sites. And basically when they showed up in the morning, all their Facebook accounts had advertisements for wearetrayvon.colorofchange.org if you're a producer or a writer or whatever, because we bought that. And then we started getting, within 24 hours, we started getting calls from journalists wanting to know if they could interview people on that site. We didn't send out a press release on it because organizations send out press releases all the time. People got it through their own, through how they were living their lives every day. Just how good journalists have always gotten stories is how they're like experiencing the world every day. And they got that story by going to their Facebook page. They saw the advertisement, they clicked on this website, and then they saw these stories and said, let me see if I can interview some of these people. And some of these people ended up on CNN iReport. They ended up, you know, telling their story. And so, you know, breaking through is complicated. And I don't think that building another website is always the most helpful thing. I do think that finding ways to connect with the way people are experiencing social media is helpful, but I don't think that Twitter is the way to sort of get people to sign your petition, because the statistics are just not good on it. People will retweet something before they click the link and actually read it. And there's a ton of statistics to show that if you're tweeting out articles, people are actually not reading the articles. They may like the title and retweet it, and so it can lead to greater brand recognition, but they're not actually opening it up and reading what you wrote. Some people are, but those are the people that would generally have read it anyway or found it anyway. Facebook, you're more likely to get people to read something, but it's a much more closed network in that people that you're sharing it with are oftentimes people who have a closer connection with you, and so as a result, they're going to, you know, and Facebook is actually a way to drive more traffic. 22 to 30% of our new members or people who sign our petitions do so because someone else shared a petition on their Facebook page that was in their network, and so third-party validation is key. And so turning people who are in your network into your validators through their Facebook networks is critical. And I think that, and then, you know, so our actual colorofchange.org over the years has become less and less important. And that does not mean that I am not like the worst enemy of the staff sometimes on keeping it updated. But it's just less and less important, and that's just based on traffic and numbers and statistics and who's coming and how often they're coming and when they're coming back. And numbers, for me, are king on that stuff.
We have, we're running a little late, so we have time for just one more question. Mary's had her hand up for a little while. So if we could keep it to a short question and response, because I want to get to your thoughts on economic security as well.
Thanks again, Rashad. I truly enjoyed your comments, and am particularly thrilled about the successes you've had with the Glenn Beck campaign, as well as your efforts regarding Alec. And it's about Alec that I want to ask a question. The deep research that you do allowed you to dig deep into an organization that's fairly obscure. Very few people fully understood the underpinnings or how that organization worked. But it was highly, Alec again is what I'm talking about, was highly effective in getting laws passed in states around this country, laws that sometimes ultimately wound up on the national stage. So the model that they use, I think, is particularly interesting. And I know you now have insights into that. And I'm wondering, how are we using that information to inform, if you will, our movement, so that we can do an Alec-like organization, okay, to have the same level of effectiveness that they did undercover, okay? So have you begun to share that with other groups that might be working with you to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I want to be clear that we benefited from the research. The research that was done that was sort of most critical for our success was done by folks like the Center for Media and Democracy and Alec Exposed and Center for American Progress and others. And we really sort of, and actually on a wide range of our campaigns, you know, Color of Change, we're campaigners. And we know how to look at research, read it, decide what's going to be the best message, but I don't have a research shop. And we actually benefit from the space of advocacy organizations out there, you know, who are doing research, and our footnotes and our outreaches and petitions are littered with, like, you know, all the organizations we know and their great work to sort of back up sort of what we're working on. You know, there's a group of organizations that have been coming together over the last, you know, 6-7 months to sort of work on a new ALEC. There used to be the Center for Policy Alternatives, which I guess closed down maybe like 5 or 6 years ago. Tim McPhilly used to run it, and it was a DC-based organization that pushed model legislation. You know, progressives are like herding cats sometimes, and so I don't know, like, if it could be exactly like ALEC in that, you know, you could. ALEC was really clear. Like, if you were an ALEC member, you were responsible for pushing these. You are responsible, not you were. You are responsible for pushing these laws when you go to these meetings and get these scholarships to go and are paid to, like, be at these behind-the-scenes, you know, fancy events. Center for Policy Alternatives put out a big booklet once a year with, like, a bunch of model legislation on everything from sort of voting rights to economic issues to social issues. And people could take those laws and have sort of a model bill that they could sort of use at state legislature level. I know that there's a lot of talk about how to do that now, and a lot of really smart people are engaged, and we've been engaged sort of, we've been definitely engaged in the conversation. I don't really know what's going to come out of it, and I don't know if it's going to look exactly like ALEC. Remember, ALEC, 98% of its money came from corporations. And so our money would probably have to come from someplace else unless you get the money from corporations and then you're pushing corporations' agenda. Yeah.
Thanks, Rashad. I definitely want to give you some time to talk a little bit about economic security. The question I had was along the lines of Mary's question, which is, as a network of about 200 scholars, practitioners, who are from different communities who have come together to focus on economic security for communities of color. What are some practical steps we can take to make this moment into a movement?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we've really been challenged in terms of we've been thinking about this a lot over the last year. Some of our best economic security work was during the housing settlement, and I think, were probably the only civil rights organization that was sort of publicly, and by publicly I mean like in the media, through petitions, pushing the Obama administration around the settlement, and so much so that we were getting a lot of blowback from the White House and from the administration on exactly what we were doing and why we were sharing our information with them before we went out. And you know, we really do see ourselves as accountability vehicle for Democrats and Republicans, and even sometimes more so for Democrats, who our members are more responsible for electing. And so in terms of, you know, I guess the best way I can maybe talk about this, how we can work together, is a couple of the key areas where we oftentimes sort of need support and need help is at times sort of, you know, finding issues inside of the issues that we can sort of have sort of downstream opportunities once we go out on our petitions. And so if we go out on something like, you know, urging, President Obama and to hold strong in a settlement, right? To then be able to work with scholars and other folks on identifying the different type of stories that we should be telling sort of as part of that, and the type of stories that are going to sort of hit on the wide range of issues, and really thinking geographically about sort of where some of the challenges are. Our list is very segmented geographically, and we can sort of build a lot more power, right? If you have nearly 900,000 people on a list, which is our membership is 900,000, that means that you have 35,000 in Detroit, you have 22,000 in Philadelphia, you have sort of these pockets of energy which can go deeper and have deeper engagement if we're sort of able to sort of crystallize where some of the greater challenges are and how that sort of impacts a national conversation. And oftentimes we're not sort of at a place to do that. We just sort of, don't have the research capacity nor the background to sort of be able to do that with the type of confidence that we need to once to hit send on something. So that's a piece of it. Over the next year, we are going to be doing a lot on jobs, and that's going to be sort of a key focus for us. We are specifically working on the Walmart work right now as a sort of entry point into the jobs for conversation and good jobs for Black folks conversation, and working very closely with WWCW and our Walmart and a lot of other folks, but trying to sort of bring a civil rights frame to the issue, mobilize our members around the issue. We're doing a lot with like letters to the editor and other things with moving our members who have signed the petition. I think we're like at 60,000 people that have like signed on to the Walmart work, and it's been a really strong, supportive group, which means that, from out of that 60,000, well over 15,000 have made phone calls on the issue. 10,000 people have agreed to do letters to the editor or something else, and so we're going to have really deep engagement on that through the year. And by the end of by the beginning of next year, we'll probably be at 100,000 people on that. But that leads us to sort of more pivot opportunities in terms of how do we then sort of translate that pivot point into sort of greater conversations about the full space, and sort of move those 100,000 people who have said, they want to stand up against Walmart, right, to sort of other sort of issues that are connecting with that storyline, and thinking about sort of the other policies that they can be impacting. And so much of our decision-making and thought process really does come from sort of collaboration with the field, and really conversations and thinking through what's happening, and then sort of what we can explain well and campaign well on where there's actually a clear sort of conversation that we can drive.